I have about 35 or 40 questions, but since I've got the mic earlier today, I'm going to ask some of you to make some comments or questions for, yes, ma'am. How are we going to do with the mics, David? Are we, while they're figuring it out, you can use this one.
Hi, how are everybody? Glad everybody came today. My name is Khadijah Jones, the Executive Director of the Campaign for Working Families. You know, there was someone else that was talking a little bit earlier about the banking and the ideology about savings, and I was talking to a couple people today that, you know, we lost the mentality of savings. We lost the mentality of it takes a village to raise the community, not just our children, but the whole community. And I just wanted to get some feedback from you of what William Penn Foundation's mission or initiatives on trying to help get us back to that same mentality that we were, where our forefathers were talking about savings and all of that. And even when you were talking, I was telling this woman that at PSFS, I remember in my kindergarten grade, putting my pennies together to put it in a book and come down to PSFS and open up my first savings account. So that happened in the public school system. So I do remember that, and we need that to come back.
But I'll just say briefly, I mean, William Penn has been going through this planning process that I've talked to some people here about, and will come out in the next couple months with a variety of different approaches around some of these issues. But let me tell you one of the approaches that we've actually been thinking about a lot, and with the making no promises and just sort of laying out. We think that this is a really, obviously, peculiar time. And it's a peculiar time because the disruptive character of technology, of demography, of the marketplace, of what the public sector is and what the public sector can't be anymore, means that we have a whole set of institutions out here, either yet to be born or have to be transformed, that we think are legacy institutions but have got to be rearranged and rethought what they are. So we were likely, as one of many things that we are going to do, are going to be try to figure out the best way to work with legacy institutions to try to make them into something different so that they can play a different role in our community. We don't think it's a time for business as usual in many ways. We don't think that we can do everything for everybody, obviously, right? But we think, you know, we're going to come out with some things. I think you'll like it. It won't, you know, we'll have an emphasis in some areas not so much. But I think what we understand is that this is a significantly different time, and that as one of the large, we talk about legacy institutions, one of the great sort of institutions in this community, has been around doing great things in civil society for 65 years. We've got the opportunity to help move things in a direction that I think you'll feel good about. So hope that isn't too much of a punt, but we'll come out and we'll be very open. If you go to our website, we've talked a little bit about what we've done so far in our planning.
I just read a wonderful book called From the Pivotal Decade, From Factories to Finance, by a historian named Judith Stein. I recommend it highly because it traces the way in which our entire economy has become dependent on the debt. So I'd like to get your thoughts on the way in which consumer credit has become a substitute for real economic growth, for a real economy, and how this is sort of a social addiction that we kind of need to break by creating a local economy perhaps tied to some of our legacy and anchor institutions in a place like Philadelphia. So I'm arguing for the localization of economies and the breaking of our dependency on corporate global capitalism that's been a massive failure. Love to hear your comments.
Well, these are not small questions you asked. So, but as you know the composition of the American GDP and what part of it, the high percentage of it that is about spending. I think that there's a good deal of thinking going on, not just in this country, but around the world, about trying to rethink economic growth and rethink what the meaning and imperatives of economic growth are. I think at the end of the day, we have to get back to a place where we understand what real productivity is. We understand that we've got a role in making products. They may be very different kinds of products than what we made 40 or 50 years ago. But I think we know that there are limits to an economy that's just about the bundling of paper and the selling and sales of paper. There are sort of limits to that, right? So I think we've got that. I would be I think that this has become a conversation all over the world, but I do think that there's this really complex subtext to this. And if you think of it from a global perspective, there are these extraordinary things that have happened in the last 20 years. I mean, 250 or 300 million people in China left poverty. There have been the entry into the global economy of hundreds of millions of people from Eastern Europe that were never part of the global economy, from India, from China, from many other places. You look at what's happening in Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, some other places. So part of what we're also adjusting to is this radical transformation where, when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, you got a premium even if you didn't have great workforce skills. You got a premium for being an American. That's over. It's over, right? And so part of what we have to as part of the straight talk we have to do in America is to make it clear that that's over, that we have to compete in really fundamentally different ways. I mean, to run an American Fortune 500 company in the 1950s when there was no global competition and not do a good job, you'd have to be like a zebra, right? I mean, it was like all the other markets had collapsed, right? Probably I would have messed it up, but it wasn't that difficult, right, from given what it is. It's a really different world now. So your question is right about debt, but there's another part of it, which is the global character of it and what it means and what it's going to mean in terms of wage issues here and the kinds of adjustments that are happening in the short term and the long term. And one other thing I would say, and this makes it even much more complicated. We talked about this a lot in our planning at William Penn. I mean, the radically disruptive nature of technology. I always said in those conversations, one day there's a chain of bookstores, and the next day they're gone, and I get a look at my iPad, and I've got 40 books on it. Wonder why, right? I don't need them anymore. And that means something in terms of jobs. We can't go back. This isn't about nostalgia for Philadelphia to go back and be a hat maker or something, right? Which was a couple blocks down the street. That's not what this is about. This is about a fundamental readjusting to a changed economy that I think is where we export high quality goods because there are things that we can do better than others, whether it's the design part of it, the technology part of it, even the high-end production part of it, whether it's the intellectual capital part of it, et cetera, right? So this is a very complicated question that you ask, but it's not a question that's about nostalgia. It's a question about facing the facts. Every once in a while, I feel like in the political conversations we see, I always feel like, what was that film where Jack Nicholson jumps up and says, "You can't handle the truth"? I always feel like nobody will be Jack Nicholson, right? And just say, "You want the truth? You can't handle the truth," right? I mean, this is the story right now, right? You think, Philadelphia, I know we feel good that we didn't lose population these last 10 years, but a lot of the growth was in poverty in the population when you disaggregate the numbers. We're still sitting in it. We're still in a place where we lost, relative to where we were in 1950, in a city, 500,000 people. People come from around the world and they go to American cities that have lost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. Baltimore, 1/3 of the population. Detroit, 1/2 of the population over 50 years. And they look, and they're not used to it because poverty in urban centers around the world is about density. Poverty here is about abandonment and isolation. It looks fundamentally different. They don't understand it. So that's another place, by the way, where thrift is important because thrift is about stewardship. It's about care. I heard the gentleman talking about gardens and about the reuse of buildings, right? So we're going to have to figure all that out, but it's not going to be used for the same thing. It's about the repurposing of those assets for something else and what they can be. So I don't have all the answers, obviously, to that, but nobody does. But what we have is what we have to face, right? There's not some simple, easy answer out there.
At the start of this, you talked about the importance of language and
Yes.
reclaiming language, but listening to you speak, I think there's also something about time.
Yeah.
And I think the disruptiveness of technology, there is assumption that we can do things faster than we did in the past, but as you know, this problem didn't happen overnight and it's not going to be solved overnight. And one of the things I think that what we throw to the answers of some of our social problems has a very short expectation of a solution.
Yeah.
Working for a non-profit, what I see now is a lot of discussion about venture philanthropy. And sort of this idea of return on investment does in fact have a time frame, and if you don't deliver on that expected time frame within what people expect, you've blown it. But I think, you know, whether it's homelessness or hunger or healthcare, these are long-term solutions that may take a lifetime. I think there are other things that probably can be done very quickly. So I wonder if there's also, when you're thinking yourself, where does time as well as language play a role, and how do we have to redefine some of the timelines, our assumptions about time?
Yeah, you know, I agree with you, but let me just sort of say it from another perspective. Look, I'm getting to be old, right? I mean, I'm amazed they hire me. I was like, last month I became 60. And this is a town I come from. I know this town. I've lived other places. This is a place I know. And one of the things that struck me when I first came to William Penn, and it's not peculiar to William Penn, they're a great place, great staff, great, terrific family, terrific board members. It's not that. Something about philanthropy, that it doesn't have an inherent sense of urgency. It doesn't have to, right? It has to come from itself. So when I look at some of these things, I have to say, I do, and I respect the issue of time and being smart about that, but I have a sense of urgency, and I really only want to do things that count. I really do. When I look at the school district of Philadelphia and what has to happen to transform that, when I look at what some of the best schools, charter, district, are doing, you know, I was the board chair for many years of Mastery, and I look at how they've taken over schools, turnaround schools, and moved kids to a place where they can achieve. I don't have time anymore. There's a part of me that says, we know how to fix things. Let's do it. What's blocking it? So I respect, but I respect what you say, because things have to have a sense of time, and I understand that, and you have to have patience, and you have to have respect for it and process. But there's a part of me that might just be getting too darn old. And there's a part of me that just wants, for certain of these things, time in this city sometimes has been an excuse to do the same old, and stay with the same old DNA, right, in terms of organizational DNA. And there's a part of me that says, let's have less patience, not more patience. Now, you know, particular things, particular projects, I mean, you know, we could argue about it or look at it that way, but there's a part of me that doesn't want to be patient. And to a, you know, that's a problem, right, in some ways, right? Probably come up with my evaluation sometime. But there's a part of me that doesn't want to be too patient, in part because I see solutions sometimes. I see things that happen in the work. And I say, let's do them. What stops the doing of them, right? So, but I know it's complicated. So, you know, I'm of two minds with it, so appreciate that. I'm out.
No, you know, you're not. I want to just jump in with a quick question, if I could. So often when people, you know, you talk to people and they have these ideas about helping people, you know, improve their finances and opportunities to save and so forth. And it always seems like the conversation is, how do we have a new program that people can take out an opportunity to do if they understand that it exists and get a certain form? Or how can we be so clever that they can do it on their phone? We want to take advantage of all the new technology. Whereas, and you kind of alluded to it, you said, well, the new institutions are going to take advantage of technology and it won't be the Bailey Brothers building and loan. But what I like, what seems to me to work in terms of who we are as human beings is cooperative institutions that put people in touch with one another and surround them with some kind of set of institutional norms, expectations. So it's not like, you know, oh, there's an opportunity. Congress passed a law and you can get a better deal if you put some money in. Hey, you know, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It seems to me that isn't that an area where guys like you ought to be putting more resources into, or something like that?
Putting more resources into, finish your sentence, into.
It may not be a credit union and it may not be a savings bank, but cooperative organizations that bring people together in some way so that they're a part of a shared institution rather than an isolated person taking advantage of a program somewhere.
I think it's context-based, and I probably increasingly I think it's generation-based, Yeah. I used to joke with Paul, like, my kid will never, I've had a 17-year-old and a 24-year-old, I'm not sure they ever picked up a newspaper. They read lots of newspapers. I literally, they've never actually gone out and bought a newspaper. They've never done the stuff we do, like, looking at the Sunday Times and having a bagel and coffee. I mean, that's over. It's gone, right? Now, I think what we've got to do is make sure that when we do that, we're not. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we want to make sure that we're not being nostalgic to a communal form that we were familiar with, as opposed to understanding who people are now and what their ability is to construct different kinds of forms. Look, the great lesson of technology and individuals in technology is the lesson of self-organization. And if you try in some instances, so you give people tools, and then you get these extraordinary kind of entrepreneurial characters that build platforms that others can sort of utilize and refashion and redo, and we sort of think about what that's meant. So I would be agnostic around form, but I would say what's the, because my kid doesn't want necessarily to be a part of that kind of institution. Maybe somebody else does, and for them that works. They've got a different way of looking at it, but they need to have the sort of the values and the opportunities that that institution embodied. I'm just I would be a little bit careful about what institutional form it takes, particularly because of the extraordinary reach of technology. In the developing world, some of the best organizations that do work with, whether it's microenterprise or sort of the savings part component of microenterprise, have had to make adaptations with technology in ways that are much richer and much more interesting than what we've done in the US. They are in rural areas in Bangladesh, and they use cell phones. Cell phone banking people's cell phone banking has transformed many countries around the world, right? I mean, so I would just sort of, maybe for some things, I would be a little bit more neutral in form. I'm always agnostic in form, but clear about what I think the value ought to be or what the opportunity is. People also look, I'm a capitalist. People have an opportunity to fail and not make those choices, right? Yeah. The question is, how do you have a set of, and how can those institutions be sustainable enough so that they don't need public and philanthropic support always to go? They've got to have an engine to be able to scale, right? So, I mean, this gets very complicated, and I don't think we're there yet. But there's great possibilities out there. I mean, you just even see the numbers in America that have moved over to credit unions, the old-fashioned credit unions, that are actually growing in terms of depositories right now, in part because of the reaction to the too big to fail debacle that we've had. So, I would just stay neutral. I think, and the thing I've sort of learned about myself certainly is that there's this just sort of incredible number of really smart young people out there that don't believe what I believe in terms of institutional form or aren't part of that, and they're inventing new things. And they're a lot smarter than me, and they know what other people want to do with it. And what we need to do sometimes is just figure out how to give them the freedom to do that. So I'd be a little bit careful sort of about that, right? So that would be my,
We have time for one more question or comment. Yes.
Yeah. First, I think great speech, and thank you for your message. Very powerful message.
Very welcome.
So you talked about how in the 50s and 60s, how banks used to go into elementary schools and encourage kids to save money. You also talked about how Calvin Klein and much of corporate America today encourages people to, kind of take in our values and put them to the marketplace. But to me, it's no coincidence that those savings programs that you talk about, when I'm born 1969, never was there a savings bank that went into any school that I went into encouraged me to open up a savings account. So clearly, at some point, in that period of time, in the mid-1970s, things began to change. And it's no coincidence that things began to change at the same time that government got into the predatory gambling business, where the daily voice of government to most citizens today is casino and lottery advertising. And just to put it in context, up into the mid-70s, government used to run campaigns with John Wayne coming out on camera saying, invest in America, buy U.S. savings bonds. You know, we used to actively encourage people to save money as a government. So we can't control Calvin Klein, but we can control our government. So my question to you is, what can we do specifically in a concrete way to get government back and encouraging people to save money, as opposed to, you know, in a very specific way, kind of getting government on the side of the savers?
That's a great question, and I don't know all the answers to that. I mean, right now we have an interest rate climate where, frankly, there's a disincentive to savings, right? I mean, you can argue back and forth about having what zero interest rates, that's a Federal Reserve issue, what that means. I said nothing.
For whom you are not speaking.
For whom I am not speaking, right? But, you know, there's always this issue about whether low rates create a misallocation of credit, right, a misallocation of resources. And it has actually a positive thing for other things. It depends on where you are in the kind of creditor-debtor positioning. So I think the thing that the public can do is information, education, and making it easy. And I think what they have to do is figure out how the facilities of and I think part of that is education. I mean, it's peculiar to me that we still put people through school. And I mean, Lord knows, in some of the schools in Philadelphia, you come out and you get very little of anything. But in most schools, the idea that you don't have the basic understanding of kind of finance and banking, I mean, just basic understanding of what that means, of what a mortgage is, of what savings represents, of what compound interest is, in this world is extraordinary to me. It's extraordinary. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, money is central to it, right? It just is. And I used to say to people at the University of Pennsylvania in their planning program, I used to teach a seminar there many, many years ago. I said, you're producing planners who don't know anything about finance and economics. Are you nuts? I mean, give them like a basic course, and like, how can you like let anybody out and do that who doesn't know anything about how a real estate deal is constructed? I mean, how's this possible, right? They don't have to be finance genius. That isn't what I was looking for. You know, make it pass fail. I don't care. Give them like something that gets them part of that. So part of it is we have to sort of decide that the country has to provide the rules of the game that allow for the right kind of transparency, right? And it also has to make it clear that part of educational curriculum has to be around that. Now, the other issues of does public infrastructure, it used to be post offices, schools, that they play this sort of broader role, I don't know. I mean, it'd be an interesting thing to think about. So I don't know. I mean, I'm with you on gambling. My father was a compulsive gambler. I was telling David, and lost all our family's money. And probably the reason I went into responsible lending is because irresponsible lenders would come around my house looking for money in the 60s. This is really true, you know. So I didn't realize until many years later that I got into the responsible lending business and responsible finance business, the constructive use of debt, because I had a really good model of what not to do. Right? And so I became in that way. So I always, you know, before I say how down I am on gambling, I always have to say I'm like the son of the alcoholic who has sort of, you know, joined the temperance union, but that's in part because of these sort of personal things. I think government's role in that is really, you know, speaking for me, I don't want to speak for, in this case, William Penn or anybody, and the government's role in sort of pushing gambling, it's just terrible. I mean, I just think it's the exact wrong thing. It's the exact wrong value that we should be pushing, you know. So but, you know, look, 6 years ago, during the height of the bubble, you know, there was predatory lenders were sponsors of the Super Bowl, right? I mean, go back and see who the sponsors were. I mean, it had been taken over in that way. I mean, literally, right? I remember getting a call from somebody saying, I can't believe it. I can't even watch the Super Bowl anymore, you know, the damn thing. So part of it is the sort of reconstruction of value, and part of it is to also have a conversation about, and this is a really hard conversation. It actually interestingly happened, probably for not the right reasons. It interestingly happened during the Republican debate the other night when there was this thing back and forth about Bain Capital, and I don't know who was right or who was wrong on that. But this whole question of what kinds of, that there are different forms of capitalism. And there's some wonderful books that have been written, actually some from the Kaufman Foundation, about the different forms of capitalism, crony capitalism, state capitalism, certain kinds of, and there's been a tendency in America to sort of accept that there's only one way to look at it, or that being pro-business of certain sectors is the same thing as being pro-market, and that is not so. Particularly with the very largest of companies that dominate certain industries. So even getting a conversation about what is the right form of capitalism, what should the rules be, how does that play out, what allows for the great kind of entrepreneurial energy that will maximize choices and inclusion while we're still building prosperity, right? Well, I mean, that's a conversation that really we haven't been allowed to have. It really sort of, not with any sort of depth. It's a conversation that's about sound bites, right, from both left and right, right? So you're asking a question that is a really complicated one, as others have, and I don't know the answer, but I would think that given the nature of the crisis we're in this country, that this is a time to ask the questions, and it's a time to demand that we have political leaders, that we have civic leaders, that we have religious leaders, that we have, and business leaders that are willing to ask those kinds of questions. And speak about that, right? I mean, who would have thought that it would be Newt Gingrich that would have gone after the 15% tax rate of Mitt Romney, right? That's like the Democrats' role, right? I mean, where did that come from, right? Now, it was just a sort of a shot, but I mean, this is an interesting, it's an interesting conversation to have. So we have a moment in time where these conversations should be open. Will we take it? I don't know. That's what this is about, I suppose, right? I'm done, right? I'm done.
Thank you. Thanks very much. This is fantastic.